Welcome back. Last time we looked at the life of Alexios I Komnenos, the emperor who did so much to save the empire from the perilous state it found itself in and restore it. But no one could have known that after all his hard work and that of his successors, the century that followed his accession to the throne would be the last hurrah for an empire that once stretched from Spain in the west, across the Mediterranean, the north of Africa, the Balkans, Anatolia, down into Egypt and into the Middle East. If Alexios I, John II and Manuel I, father, son and grandson, represented the best of the Komnenoi, it wasn't long before the family brought forward its worst. Andronicus was Manuel I's cousin, both grandsons of Alexios, but whereas Manuel was called to greatness, Andronicus was called to other things. Tall, handsome and charming, Andronicus was born into wealth and privilege, but his comfortable upbringing was interrupted when his father Isaac tried to kill the Emperor John II. Bad enough, but doubly so given that John was Isaac's brother. That led to 6 years on the run until Isaac and John reconciled and Andronicus moved back into Constantinople and royal circles. By all accounts, Andronicus and Manuel were close. They were of similar age and had grown up together. As emperor, Manuel found various jobs for Andronicus to do, but he gained a reputation for handling them all carelessly. Manuel put him at the head of an army and sent him to repel Armenian invaders in Cilicia. By the time Andronicus was finished, much of the army was gone, and the Armenians held more of Byzantine territory than they had before Andronicus had arrived. Perhaps ironic that Manuel then made Andronicus the governor of what was left of the area. In 1152, Andronicus slept with Manuel's niece, effectively committing incest in the eyes of the church, but managed to talk his way out of trouble. He then conspired with Hungarians to remove Manuel from the throne so that Andronicus could become emperor, which was much harder to talk his way out of. Manuel found out, and no amount of sweet talking could stop Manuel from imprisoning him within the palace in Constantinople. This was far from the end of the story for Andronicus, though. 4 years later, he dug his way out of his cell with his bare hands and escaped, but was swiftly recaptured and imprisoned in a stronger cell. 5 years later, he escaped again, narrowly evaded recapture, and disappeared off into Galicia, where he became part of the royal court there. While in Galicia, he continued to conspire to replace Manuel and tried to recruit Cumans to launch an army against him. Despite this, Manuel eventually reconciled with Andronicus, and he returned to Constantinople. He didn't stay there long. After refusing to take an oath of loyalty to the King of Hungary, he was sent again to Cilicia as governor. He didn't stay there long either, and shortly afterwards abandoned his post and travelled to Antioch, where he seduced Manuel's sister-in-law, Philippa of Antioch. The scandal caused Manuel to once again recall Andronicus to Constantinople, but Andronicus declined and ran away with Philippa to Jerusalem, where King Amalric made him ruler of Beirut. Once in Beirut, Andronicus thanked him by seducing Theodora, the widow of Amalric's brother, for whom he left Philippa. The scandal once again caused Manuel to recall Andronicus to Constantinople, and once again Andronicus demurred, eloping with Theodora and ending up this time in Damascus, where they found a warm welcome among the Muslim population. They settled and had 2 children. They lived happily for a while, but Manuel eventually caught up with them. Theodora and the children were captured and taken back to Constantinople. Andronicus followed and, with a great display of contrition, reconciled with Manuel once again and was made governor of Paphlagonia on the Black Sea. In 1180, Manuel I died and was succeeded by his son Alexios II. Alexios was only 11 years old, so his mother, Maria of Antioch, ruled as regent, but her position was weak because she was Latin at a time of rising anti-Latin tension within the empire. So, as an elder statesman of sorts, by this time he was in his 60s, Andronicus was summoned back to Constantinople once again to act as protector of Alexios. This time, Andronicus did come back, and in May of 1182, he carried Alexios II into the Hagia Sophia on his shoulders to be crowned emperor. And within the next year, he killed Alexios II, his mother Maria, and anyone who'd been loyal to them, and married Alexios' young wife Agnes of France, who was 11. After that, things got really bad. During his short reign, Andronicus seems to have alienated just about everyone, and he was eventually overthrown by Isaac Angelos, who had almost unwittingly found himself at the head of a rebellion. Andronicus was thrown to a mob and killed horribly in the Hippodrome. It was the end of the Komnenos dynasty and the beginning of the end of Byzantium. After Andronicus' death, the mob acclaimed Isaac as emperor, and his reign began promisingly. He defeated a major Norman invasion that had already taken Thessaloniki and secured the empire's immediate western frontiers. But his government soon slid into fiscal exploitation and political instability, provoking aristocratic revolts and, crucially, failing to prevent an uprising that created a revived Bulgarian kingdom in the Balkans. In 1195, while preparing a campaign against the Bulgarians, Isaac was overthrown, blinded, and imprisoned with his son by Isaac's brother, who seized the throne as Alexios III Angelos. Alexios III's rule was notable for chronic financial weakness, court corruption, and military neglect. He debased the coinage, sold offices, and allowed frontier defences to wither, even as the empire faced pressure from Bulgarians, Seljuks, and ambitious Western princes and Crusaders. It was under this failing regime that Isaac's son, confusingly also named Alexios, escaped captivity and went west, eventually ending up in Venice looking for help. We were last in Venice in the 880s, and it's fair to say that the city has prospered since then, as it has gradually emerged from Byzantine oversight to become an autonomous city-state under a hereditary-style doge, while still formally acknowledging the Eastern Emperor. By the 11th century, it had extended its influence up and down the Adriatic, subduing pirate bases and asserting control over coastal cities in Istria and Dalmatia, which secured the sea lanes on which the city's salt, timber, and carrying trade depended. At the same time, the city's institutions had slowly evolved. The Doge's power was increasingly balanced by councils drawn from leading families, laying the foundations for the mixed oligarchic republic it was to become, rather than a simple monarchy. Between 1050 and 1200, Venice turned maritime strength into a commercial empire, reaching across the eastern Mediterranean, helped by privileged trading quarters and tax concessions in Constantinople and other Byzantine ports. Participation in the First Crusade and subsequent expeditions gave Venetians new bases and markets in the Levant, while the construction of the great arsenal in the 12th century allowed the Republic to build fleets quickly and on an almost industrial scale. So by the late 12th century, Venice had become a dominant intermediary between East and West, its patrician merchants organising early exchange and credit operations, and its government already showing the tight linkage between political power and great trading houses that would come to define the high medieval republic. Relations between Venice and Byzantium were formally those of long-standing allies, but in practice they'd become tense and mutually resentful. Since the reign of Alexios I Komnenos, Venice had enjoyed sweeping trade privileges, including duty-free commerce and its own quarter in Constantinople, which made its merchants dominant in imperial markets and indispensable as naval allies against the Normans. But these concessions were increasingly viewed in Constantinople as economically damaging and politically humiliating, and popular hostility towards the wealthy, tax-favoured Venetian communities steadily grew. John II and Manuel I both tried to curb Venetian influence, culminating in the mass arrest and confiscation of Venetian property in 1171, which for Venetians was a profound betrayal. On top of that, commercial rivalry, especially the empire's attempts to balance Venice by favouring other Italian cities like Genoa and Pisa, deepened the rift and turned a once useful alliance into a relationship of armed codependence and simmering hatred. By the end of the 12th century, Venice still operated under imperial charters in Byzantine territory, but the political and emotional fabric of the alliance was badly frayed, making a violent rupture likely when circumstances allowed. Circumstances did allow in the form of Enrico Dandolo, who became Doge in 1192. He had long experience of Byzantium, which bred in him a mixture of intimate knowledge, deep distrust, and hard-edged opportunism. Before becoming Doge, he had served repeatedly as a Venetian envoy to Constantinople in the 1170s and the 1180s, negotiating over the restitution of Venetian property after imperial crackdowns and experiencing at first hand both the wealth of the empire and the volatility of its politics. Dandolo was blind, and many writers have linked this blindness to anti-Latin violence in the city, a story that may not be provable but reflects a widespread sense that he had been personally wronged there and never forgot it. As Doge, he treated Byzantium less as a spiritual sister empire and more as a dangerously unreliable neighbour whose resources and trade routes had to be controlled for Venice's security. And as much as he might have disliked Byzantium personally, he pursued policies that subordinated any personal sentiment to the interests of Venetian power and commerce. Modern historians are quite cautious about turning Dandolo into a man obsessed with revenge, even though later tradition loved the story of a blind Doge settling a personal score. And rightly so. To follow this narrative is to turn Dandolo into a two-dimensional cartoon character. Contemporary sources don't show him talking in terms of revenge, and recent scholarship stresses that his decisions were framed above all by hard Venetian interests, recovering commercial privileges, securing repayment of massive outlays on the fleet, and exploiting a moment of imperial weakness to reshape the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. All that being said, he operated in a political culture saturated with memories of broken promises, mass arrests, and anti-Latin violence in the empire, and it is very likely that he, like many of his peers, carried a strong emotional hostility to Byzantium that made the idea of humbling Constantinople highly satisfying as well as highly profitable. So, after escaping from captivity in Constantinople, Alexios made his way west to the court of his brother-in-law Philip of Swabia, where his plight caught the attention of Boniface of Montferrat, soon to be chosen as leader of the Fourth Crusade. It was probably through discussions with Boniface and other German princes that the idea first crystallized of using the crusading army, already contracted to Venice for transport, to recover his father's throne, with Alexios offering, in return, not only restitution for past wrongs, but a wholesale realignment of Byzantium with Latin Christendom, a healing of the Great Schism. From Germany, he travelled to where the Crusader army was gathered in Venice and then moved with it onto its winter base at Zara, where the army, deep in debt to its Venetian carriers and unsure of its next step, was unusually open to bold proposals. And at this point, Alexios laid out the extravagant package that would underpin his negotiations with both Venetians and Crusader leaders. He promised to clear the Crusaders' crushing transport debt by paying off what was owed to Venice, to add a staggering 200,000 silver marks in further subsidies, to provide 10,000 Byzantine soldiers and the service of the imperial fleet to carry the expedition on to Egypt, to maintain 500 knights in the Holy Land at imperial expense, and to bring the Byzantine Church into obedience to Rome. For men like Dandolo, this offer held out the prospect of financial salvation and a decisive extension of Venice's influence in the Eastern Mediterranean. For Crusader leaders, it seemed to solve their monetary crisis and strengthen their campaign with imperial resources, even though the promises were vastly beyond what Byzantium could realistically deliver. The bargain concluded at Zara bound Alexios to their cause and, just as importantly, bound the Crusaders to his. From that moment, the road to Jerusalem ran through Constantinople, setting the stage for the diversion of the fleet to the Bosphorus and the chain of events that would end in the fall of the city. In 1203, the Crusader Venetian fleet appeared before Constantinople, forced the defences of the Golden Horn, and Alexios III fled, leaving the capital to restore Isaac II, now blind and enfeebled, as senior emperor with his son as Alexios IV Angelos. To absolutely no one's surprise, the new co-emperors immediately struggled to raise the vast sums promised to their Western backers. Heavy taxation, confiscations from churches and monasteries, and failed attempts to tap provincial resources bred intense resentment among both the general population and the elite, who saw them as puppets of Latin creditors. Tensions inside the city erupted into anti-Latin riots and fires, while relations with the Crusaders deteriorated as deadlines passed and payments lagged, leaving Alexios IV increasingly desperate and politically isolated. With the empire at an already low ebb, re-enter our old friends, the Ducas family. In early 1204, a palace coup brought Alexios V Ducas to power. He had Alexios IV strangled and let Isaac die soon after, then tried to rally the capital by repairing defences and refusing further concessions to the Western army outside the walls. Alexios most likely knew he couldn't hope to beat the Crusader Venetian army in open battle. His hope was to make Constantinople itself do the fighting for him. Contemporary accounts stress that he moved quickly to close the city's gates, strengthen and repair the land and sea walls, and organise regular patrols and counterattacks, using the fortifications and the Great Chain across the Golden Horn as force multipliers. He also tried to exploit the enemy's vulnerabilities. The army outside was short of supplies, quarrelling internally, and encamped in unhealthy conditions. So Alexios V led or encouraged night raids and sorties to disrupt foraging parties and shipping, hoping attrition, bad weather, and disunity would eventually compel the besiegers to withdraw. Politically and psychologically, he counted on the renewed resolve of a population that had turned violently against the Latins and their former emperors, presenting himself as a vigorous anti-Latin defender of the faith who could unify the capital in a last stand. In that sense, his plan rested on three assumptions: that the walls, if properly manned, were practically impregnable, that the besiegers' finances and cohesion would crack more quickly than the city's morale, and that a display of determined resistance might yet bring relief or force negotiations on better terms. What he underestimated was the combination of Venetian naval expertise with the Crusaders' desperation, as well as the degree to which internal divisions among the Byzantine elite would sap the very unity on which his defensive strategy depended. His energetic resistance couldn't compensate for years of military decay and internal division. After repulsing initial assaults, the sea walls were breached in April 1204. The Crusaders and Venetians stormed Constantinople, Alexios V fled, and the city was subjected to a devastating sack that ended the Angelid dynasty and shattered the Byzantine Empire into successor states. After 900 years, Constantinople had finally fallen, not to Muslims or Seljuks or Bulgarians or Pechenegs or to 1,000 other enemies over the centuries, but to Christians. After fleeing Constantinople by boat, Alexios V made his way to join the ex-emperor Alexios III, but instead of receiving help, he was treated as a rival. Alexios III had him seized and blinded, then abandoned him to the advancing Latin forces, who captured him and took him back to Constantinople, where the new Latin regime tried and executed him by throwing him from the column of Theodosius. Unlike some of his ancestors in the Ducas family, Alexios V wasn't a bad emperor as much as a capable but ultimately doomed one. He seized power by a ruthless coup and was involved, directly or indirectly, in the deaths of Isaac II and Alexios IV, which clearly stains his reputation. But at the same time, he showed more energy and seriousness about defending Constantinople than his Angelid predecessors, quickly closing the gates, shoring up the walls, organising sorties, and trying to use the city's fortifications and popular anger against the Latins to offset the besiegers' numerical and logistical advantages. The main criticisms of his rule focus on the way his policies deepened internal divisions. His confiscation of wealth from the aristocracy and expulsion of resident Latins won him support among ordinary citizens, but alienated powerful elites whose backing he so desperately needed at a moment of crisis. From 1183, with the accession of Andronicus I Komnenos, through Isaac II Angelos, Alexios III Angelos, and Alexios IV Angelos, Byzantium suffered 20 years of some of the worst possible emperors at the worst possible time. Judged by outcomes, Alexios V Ducas looks to be just another hopeless emperor. He presided over the loss of the capital and the effective collapse of the empire, after all, which makes him look disastrous in retrospect. But judged by the options actually available in early 1204, he appears more as a last-ditch defender trying, with some tactical competence but limited political skill, to salvage an almost unsalvageable situation created by years of misrule before he ever came to the throne. After the sack of Constantinople, the centuries-old Byzantine Empire was divided up amongst the Crusaders, becoming a patchwork of individual principalities, and Venice, which took over the port of Constantinople and other ports in the eastern Mediterranean. Despite appearances, this didn't spell the end of the empire. In the aftermath, Byzantine aristocrats created new centres of power, most notably the Empire of Nicaea in northwestern Anatolia, the Despotate of Epirus on the Adriatic, and the Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast. These states claimed to be the legitimate heirs of the old empire and competed with the Latin emperors in Constantinople, as well as with regional powers such as Bulgaria and the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum for territory and prestige. Over time, Nicaea emerged as the strongest of these Greek polities, expanding in Western Asia Minor and the Balkans as its rivals faltered. The Latin rulers never really seemed interested in building anything on the bones of Byzantium. They seemed happy to plunder their new territories and ship riches back to the west. Between the 1220s and 1260s, the Latin Empire steadily declined, battered by military defeats and deprived of the resources needed to dominate its Greek and Balkan neighbours. Conversely, Nicaean rulers consolidated their gains, and under the general and later emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos, prepared a concerted effort to recover Constantinople. In 1261, Nicaean forces seized the city and restored a Byzantine empire to the throne, re-establishing the empire but on a drastically reduced territorial and economic base compared with the pre-1204 state. We'll look at the restoration and the final decline of Byzantium next time, but for now, thanks very much for joining me. Please remember to like, share and subscribe on your way out, and whatever you're up to, have a great day.